The war was over, and the galaxy was still catching its breath. For 112 years, the Krath Dominion had pushed through star system after star system, leaving nothing behind but ash and silence. They had crushed the Valorian fleet in 3 hours. They had turned the green moon of Sereth into a dead rock. They had made entire species forget what peace felt like. Then the humans arrived. Nobody had expected much from humans when they first joined the Galactic Coalition. Humans were small compared to the towering Drawn. They were slow compared to the silver-fingered Fail. They had no natural armor, no poison glands, no hive mind. They simply showed up with strange eyes and loud voices and an unusual habit of laughing at things that were not funny. But humans were stubborn in a way that no other species fully understood. They did not stop. They did not retreat. They did not calculate the odds and decide that the situation was hopeless. They just kept going, and somewhere in that endless forward motion, the war began to turn. Sergeant Ethan Voss was the best example of what a human soldier could be. He was not the tallest man in the coalition forces. He was not the loudest or the most decorated when the war began. He was a quiet man with short brown hair and pale gray eyes and a habit of reading old mission reports long after everyone else had gone to sleep. He had fought on 19 different planets. He had held a communications post for 6 days alone when his entire unit was cut off. He had carried a wounded Drawn soldier 4 kilometers through burning jungle because the Drawn was too heavy for anyone else to lift. By the end of the war, the galaxy knew his name. They called him the Nail, because once he was pointed at something, he went all the way through. He had more confirmed mission completions than any other single soldier in the coalition, and the Krath had put a bounty on his head so large that 3 of their own generals had quietly tried to collect it. None of them succeeded. The day the Krath Emperor signed the Treaty of Surrender, the entire coalition held celebrations that lasted for 11 days. Fireworks went off above orbital stations. Light shows painted the clouds of 100 worlds. Beings who had never met each other danced in the streets because the long, dark thing was finally over. Ethan Voss sat in a small room on the station Aurelius Prime and read a file. Grand Conclave of 7 Species was held on the 14th day after the treaty signing. It was the largest gathering of galactic leadership in recorded history. Representatives came from every member world. Every major species sent its most important figures. The hall itself was built for exactly this kind of moment, with tall arching ceilings and walls made of a pale stone that seemed to glow from inside. By ancient coalition treaty, a hero of the highest designation had the right to name one reward from the defeated enemy's holdings. It was an old tradition from the early days of the coalition, meant to honor those who gave everything. It had only been invoked 9 times in 400 years. The last time was after the Siege of Drell, when Admiral Koss of the Drawn asked for a private island on a neutral world and spent the rest of his life growing fruit. Ethan Voss had been given the highest designation. A vote of the full conclave was not even needed. The records simply spoke for themselves. He walked into the hall that day in his regular field uniform because he had forgotten about the ceremony until someone knocked on his door an hour before it started. His boots were clean, at least. The hall went quiet when he entered. Not the polite quiet of respect, but the held-breath quiet of anticipation. Every diplomat, every general, every high official in that enormous room had been making guesses for days. The Fail ambassador had told her staff she expected him to ask for a fleet of warships. The Drawn Council had warned their treasurers that he might request an entire planet. The Krath Emperor, sitting in the prisoner section of the gallery, had spent 3 nights unable to sleep, imagining what the human would take. Ethan walked to the center of the hall, stood at the speaker's mark, and looked around at all of them. The conclave chair, a tall blue-skinned Valorian named Sora Vel, cleared her throat and spoke in the formal tongue of the coalition. She said that it was the honor of the conclave to recognize his service, and that by ancient right he was permitted to name one reward from the holdings of the defeated Craft Dominion. Ethan nodded and said he would like to speak with the prisoners before he decided. The silence in the hall changed. It went from anticipation to confusion. The conclave chair blinked her large pale eyes and asked him to repeat himself. He did. She looked at the other officials. They looked at each other. Nobody moved. A moment, because nobody had prepared for this answer. It had never been done before. A hero standing in that circle with the entire galaxy watching had never once asked to meet the prisoners first. They asked for things. Ships, land, power, a title, a name on a monument. Nobody had ever asked for a conversation. The conclave chair said there was no rule against it, and a guard was sent to arrange access. Ethan thanked her and stepped back and waited with his hands in his pockets, while the entire hall tried to figure out what he was doing. In the prisoner section, the Krath Emperor gripped the arms of his seat so hard the stone cracked. He had 11 children in that detention block. He had warlords and generals and advisors. He had beings of enormous value and enormous danger. He had no idea which one the human wanted, and that not knowing was the worst thing he had ever felt. Ethan was taken to the detention wing an hour later. It was a long corridor with cells along both sides. The guards walked with him and offered to introduce each prisoner by rank and value. He said he would just walk and look. They thought this was strange, but they let him do it. He passed the generals first, large armored beings with battle scars and hard eyes that followed him down the corridor. He passed the warlords. 3 of them had personally ordered attacks on human worlds. He passed 2 of the Emperor's sons, who stood straight and proud, and radiated the kind of cold power that came from never having been told no. He kept walking. Near the end of the corridor, in a cell with no special markings and no guard posted outside, sat a small figure. She was thin, with skin the color of pale violet and gray freckles across her nose and cheeks. She had enormous dark eyes that looked up when he stopped in front of her cell, with the careful expression of someone who had learned a long time ago not to show hope, because hope only made the disappointment worse. She was Princess Valeth, 7th daughter of the Krath Emperor. She had no military rank. She had never commanded anything. She had not been mentioned once in any of the peace negotiations because nobody on either side had thought to mention her. Ethan looked at her for a moment and then asked her name. She blinked. She looked at the guards to see if this was some kind of trick. The guards looked as confused as she felt. She turned back to the human and said her name was Valeth. He nodded slowly. Then he turned around, walked back down the corridor, past all the generals and warlords and imperial sons, went back through the security doors, walked into the main hall, stood at the speaker's mark, and told the entire conclave that he had made his choice. He chose her. The silence lasted 4 full seconds, and then the hall exploded. The Council of 7 debated for 3 hours after Ethan made his choice. The Fail ambassador stood up and suggested politely that the human might be confused. The drawn council representative cleared his throat 3 times and asked whether the choice could be reconsidered. The Krath Emperor said nothing. He sat very still, with an expression that was impossible to read, and his hands completely flat on his knees. Soravel, the conclave chair, looked at Ethan for a long time, and then asked him if he was certain. He said yes. She wrote it in the official record, and that was that. The galaxy had a new problem it did not know what to do with. Valeth was transferred to a neutral guest suite on Aurelius Prime the same day. She had been in that detention cell for 43 days. She had been given food and water, and nothing else. No books, no contact with the outside, no news of the war's end, no explanation of what was going to happen to her. She had sat in that cell and waited, and the waiting had been its own kind of wait. The suite had a window that looked out at the stars. She stood at that window for a long time after the door was unlocked, and she was told she could move around freely. She did not quite believe it yet. She kept expecting someone to come in and tell her the real rules. Ethan knocked on the door an hour after she arrived. He was holding a tray with food on it. The station kitchen had made something warm, and the smell of it reached her before she could see what it was. He set it on the table and pulled out a chair and sat down across from it, and then looked at her and waited. She stood near the window and did not move. He did not tell her to sit. He did not explain what he wanted from her. He did not ask questions. He just waited with the same patience he used when he read old mission reports, which was to say a very complete and unhurried patience that had no performance in it. After a while she sat down and ate. The food was not craft food, but it was good. She ate all of it, and when she was done, she folded her hands on the table and looked at him, and waited for him to tell her what came next. He said he had read her file that she knew of. She was the 7th daughter. She had no rank, no title that mattered, no military record. She had attended academic institutions and written papers on xenobiology, and spent 3 years in the Northern Palace libraries, cataloging cultural records from 42 species. She was not the kind of person who had a file. He slid a small data card across the table. She picked it up and looked at it. He told her the Coalition's intelligence division had intercepted certain coded messages over the past 3 years. Messages that went from the Northern Palace libraries through a relay station near the Krath border to a human resistance cell operating in the Veth corridor. Valeth went very still. The messages had contained evacuation routes, timed patrol schedules for 3 different Krath border stations, safe house locations, names of sympathetic Krath officials who would look away from refugee movements. They had been written in a cipher that used a combination of 2 dead languages and a third that was technically classified as extinct. The Coalition's codebreakers had taken 19 months to crack it. 412 refugees had made it through the Veth corridor because of those messages. Humans, Fail Valorians, beings who would have been captured and processed and never heard from again. They had walked out of Krath territory alive because someone in a library had decided to do something about it, and had done it carefully and quietly, and without any expectation of being thanked. Valeth looked at the data card for a long time. She set it down on the table, and said nothing. Ethan said that the resistance cell she had helped had filed a full report with the Coalition Command 6 months before the war ended. He said that report was sitting in an archive marked low priority because nobody had connected the cipher to a member of the Imperial family. Nobody had looked because nobody had thought to look. He said he had looked. She asked him why. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said that he had a habit of reading the whole file, not just the part at the top that said what something was worth. He said most people stopped at the summary. He said summaries were usually wrong. What followed that conversation was not dramatic. It was small and slow and took time. Valeth was not suddenly transformed into a confident and celebrated figure. She was a being who had spent most of her life being told that her interests were useless, that her curiosity about other species was embarrassing, that her preference for libraries over battlefields was a personal failing. She had been invisible for so long that visibility felt like a threat. She started slowly. She answered his questions about Krath culture when he asked them. At first, she kept her answers short, expecting him to lose interest. When he did not, she made them longer. When he asked follow-up questions that showed he had actually listened to her previous answers, she had to stop and collect herself, because that was not something she was used to. The news that Ethan had chosen a minor Krath princess spread through diplomatic channels quickly, and the reactions were various. A popular commentary program run by a drawn journalist called the choice eccentric. A fail academic paper published within a week suggested it was a political maneuver designed to destabilize the Krath succession. The Krath Emperor's official statement said nothing about Valeth specifically, which was itself a statement. 3 different Coalition diplomats visited Ethan in that first week to politely explain that his choice had created complications. He listened to all of them. He thanked them for their time. He told each one that he understood their concerns. He did not change anything. Valeth heard these conversations through the thin wall between the 2 suites. She had not intended to listen, but the station walls were not built for privacy. She expected Ethan to eventually agree with the diplomats, to find a polite way to undo what he had done, to decide that the complications were not worth it. After the third diplomat left, she heard him on the other side of the wall, making tea. The sound of it was so ordinary that she had to sit down. She had spent 3 years sending coded messages through a dead language cipher to help beings she would never meet escape a system she could not leave. She had done it because it was the right thing to do, and because doing nothing had felt like a kind of dying. She had not expected anyone to notice. She had not expected it to matter beyond the 412 people who had walked to safety. On the 8th day, Ethan knocked on her door again and asked if she would be willing to look at a document. He said the Coalition's reconstruction team was trying to understand Krath territorial customs in the eastern sectors, and they were getting confused by something. He said she probably knew more about it than anyone in the building. A paper on it 2 years ago that no one had read. She took the document and sat down at the table and began to explain, and for the first time in a very long time, the explanation mattered to someone who was listening. It started with a document about a water dispute. The Eastern Krath territories shared a border with a system of small planets that had been under Krath administration for decades. The beings who lived on those planets were a quiet species called the moth. They were not warriors. They grew food and made careful records of the seasons and had a very detailed oral tradition about the movement of water through the land. The Krath had redirected 3 of their major rivers 40 years ago to serve mining operations. And now with the Krath Dominion collapsed and no one managing those redirections, the water had nowhere to go, and 3 of the Moth's most populated valleys were flooding. The Coalition's reconstruction team had been arguing about this for 6 weeks. 2 factions had formed. One said the water had to go back to its original path immediately. The other said moving it back too fast would destroy the mining infrastructure, which 6 other species depended on for materials, and that would cause a different crisis. They had produced 47 reports and solved nothing. Valith read their reports in one evening. The next morning she asked Ethan if she could attend the reconstruction meeting. He said yes. She asked if he would come. She said she thought it would help if he was there. He asked why. She said because people paid attention when he was in a room, and she needed them to pay attention. He went. She sat at the corner of the long table and waited for the 2 factions to finish arguing. When they paused, she asked a question about the original riverbed. She asked whether anyone had consulted the Moth's historical water records. The 2 faction leaders looked at each other and then at her. One asked who she was. Ethan said her name from the back of the room, in a tone that was entirely flat and entirely final. And both faction leaders decided not to follow up on the question. Valith explained that the Moth kept records going back 800 years of every major flood, dry season, and water movement in their territories. She said those records would show exactly how the rivers had moved before the Krath redirected them, and that the original path was almost certainly still intact, underground, because the Moth had built their settlements around it specifically. She said the water could be moved back over 18 months along the original underground channels, which would protect both the Moth's valleys and the mining infrastructure. The room was quiet. The Conclave's chief reconstruction advisor, a Fail woman named Issy, who had been doing this work for 40 years, asked Valith where she had learned this. Valith said she had written a paper on Moth territorial hydrology 2 years ago. It had been published in a minor academic journal. No one had read it. Issy asked for a copy. Valith sent it to her that afternoon. By the following week it was the working document for the entire Eastern Territory's water resolution. By the end of the month, the Moth were helping Coalition engineers locate the underground channels. Word moved fast in diplomatic circles. The story of the 7th Krath princess and the water document became the kind of thing people mentioned in briefings. When the next reconstruction problem came up, a territorial dispute between 2 Krath noble houses that had been simmering for 20 years, someone thought to ask Valith if she had written anything about it. She had. 3 papers actually, 2 in dead languages, and 1 in a cipher that turned out to be the same cipher she had used for the resistance messages, because she had not wanted anyone in the palace reading her academic work. The Coalition's translation team spent a week very quietly decoding her complete bibliography. She was invited to her first formal diplomatic session 6 weeks after the conclave. It was a meeting about craft succession law and how it affected the post-war power structure. She sat in the back. She was not introduced. She had no official status. She was simply present because Issy had asked her to attend in case there were questions. There were questions. She answered them from the back of the room. The session chair, a large Dron named Velgas, kept turning around to look at her, and then back at his notes, and then back at her. He asked her 3 times if she was certain about things she said. 3 times she was certain, and 3 times he verified it afterward, and 3 times she was right. After the session, Ethan walked in. He had been outside the whole time. He had not been invited. He was simply standing in the corridor when Valeth came out. He fell into step beside her. He did not say anything about the session. She did not say anything about it either. They walked to the station's observation deck and looked at the stars for a while. And that was that. But it had been noticed. The Galaxy Commentary Network ran a piece the next day. It described an unnamed source close to the reconstruction process, who had apparently resolved 3 major post-war issues in under 2 months. It noted that this source was connected to Sergeant Ethan Voss, the war hero who had made an unusual choice at the Grand Conclave. It did not name Valeth, but it did not need to. The diplomatic community already knew. The Fail ambassador who had suggested Ethan might be confused sent him a very formal apology note. She included a small gift of Fail ceremonial tea, which was the highest form of apology in Fail culture, and also quite expensive. Ethan made the tea and shared it with Valeth, and neither of them said anything about the apology. What changed for Valeth was not sudden. It was a slow shifting of how she held herself in rooms. She had spent so many years making herself smaller, taking up less space, speaking less clearly than she thought, so that the thought would not seem threatening. That unlearning it was not simple. She still started sentences, and then stopped herself. She still waited to be asked, rather than volunteering. She still looked for the exits in every room, out of a habit she could not fully name. But she stopped being surprised when people listened. 6 weeks after the water dispute, she was sitting in a formal briefing room with 11 senior coalition officials, and she was explaining craft succession law from first principles, because 2 of the 11 did not understand the basic structure, and the whole briefing had stalled. She was not nervous. She was just explaining a thing she knew very well, and the room was very quiet, and everyone was looking at her, and it was fine. Afterward, a young craft diplomat named Reth, who had defected to the coalition side 6 months before the war ended, found her in the corridor. He had been in that briefing room. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not quite read, and then he asked her how she trusted the human. She thought about it for a moment. She said that Ethan was the first person who had looked at what she had done rather than what she had been born as. She said that was a simple thing, but she had never encountered it before, and it had made her understand that the simple things were not always small. Reth nodded slowly and walked away. That evening, Ethan told her he had been offered a generalship. He had turned it down. He had also been offered a colony world and a fleet command. He had turned those down too. Actually wanted. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said he wanted to build something that lasted. He said he had been thinking about an institute, a place where beings from different species could learn each other's cultures and languages and histories properly. Not the summaries, the whole files. He said he wanted her to run it. She looked at him for a long time. The stars outside the window were very bright. She said she would think about it. She had already decided yes, but she needed a moment to let it feel real before she said it out loud. The institute opened on a Tuesday. It was not a grand building. It was a converted research station on a mid-tier orbital platform that had been used during the war for supply logistics. The walls were still the original pale gray, and the floors were the kind of flat dark material that did not show scuffs. Valeth had filled it with books. She had sourced them from 40 different worlds in 14 different languages, and stacked them in rooms that were organized not by species or language, but by subject, because she believed that the most important thing was the subject, not who had written about it. On the first day, 11 students arrived. They were from 7 different species. 3 had been sent by coalition governments. 2 had come on their own after hearing about the institute through the diplomatic community. 1 was a very old Fail woman who said she had been wanting to understand craft territorial law for 30 years and had finally found someone who could teach it. By the 3rd month, there were 60 students. By the 6th month, there were over 200. Valith taught 6 courses herself. She taught Krath cultural history. She taught comparative xenobiology. She taught the history of the Veth corridor. She taught a seminar on how language shapes political assumptions that became the most attended session of every month. She graded papers personally and wrote long, careful notes in the margins, and the students came back for more because her notes were better than most lectures they had ever attended. The Institute also produced reports. The Coalition's reconstruction teams began requesting them regularly. Issy, the Fail Reconstruction Advisor, became one of its most frequent readers. 3 of the reports directly shaped policy decisions in the Eastern Territories. 1 prevented what would have been a very expensive conflict over fishing rights in a shared ocean system by pointing out that the 2 species involved had both independently developed a custom of settling such disputes through formal meal sharing, and that no one had thought to suggest this. The galaxy began to pay a different kind of attention. The Krath Emperor noticed. He had been confined to a planet in the neutral zone under a monitoring agreement. He was not imprisoned. He had staff and communication access and a reasonable amount of comfort. He was simply not allowed to leave or to hold any formal authority. His 10 remaining children had scattered. Some had accepted positions in the new Krath governing structure that the Coalition was helping to build. Some had gone into private life. None of them mattered to him the way Valith mattered now. She had been the one he thought of least. She had been the embarrassment, the quiet one, the one who read instead of fought, the one he had once told to stop wasting her time on dead languages because it made the family look soft. Now her name was in Coalition reports. Her institute was shaping decisions that reached into the very territories he used to rule. She had more real influence on the post-war Krath world than any of his sons. He could not reach her directly. He was monitored. He could not threaten her. He was watched. But there were things a careful person could still do from a monitored neutral planet. If they were patient, and if they had the right contacts in the right places, and if they understood that the best weapon against someone who had risen on credibility was doubt. The documents appeared 6 months after the Institute opened. They were distributed through 3 different channels simultaneously, so that no single source could be easily discredited. They were detailed. They cited specific dates and specific messages. They claimed to show that Valith had been operating as a Krath intelligence asset inside the Coalition's reconstruction process from the beginning. That her work on the water dispute had been designed to leave certain Krath loyalist structures intact. That her institute was a collection operation, pulling information from Coalition diplomats and feeding it to remnant Krath networks. The documents were fabricated with extraordinary care. Within 48 hours, the story was everywhere. The Galaxy Commentary Network ran it first, then every other major outlet followed. The Conclave's Internal Security Office opened an investigation. 3 coalition governments that had been partnering with the Institute suspended their relationships. 60 students left. Some of them left notes that were unkind. Valith read every one. She did not collapse. She did not go silent. She asked for a formal hearing and she got one. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks out. The 2 weeks were the longest she had experienced since the detention cell. And they were worse in a different way, because in the detention cell, she had not had anything to lose. Ethan disappeared for a week. He did not explain where he was going. He left a note that said he would be back before the hearing. He was gone for 7 days. Valith ran the Institute alone during that week. She taught her 6 courses. She graded papers. She answered every question she was asked. She showed up to every meeting that had not been cancelled. Fewer of those than before, but she showed up to all of them. The hearing was held in a formal coalition chamber, with representatives from 11 governments and the full internal security panel. Valith sat at the front table alone. She had no legal representation. She had not asked for any. She had her notes and her memory, and 14 years of knowing exactly what she had actually done and why. She was precise. She was calm. She answered every question completely. She did not become defensive. She did not explain herself in the way of someone who felt guilty. She explained herself in the way of someone who had simply done a thing and kept records of it, because record-keeping was what she did. For 3 hours she held the room. In the 4th hour, Ethan walked in. He had 7 years of classified battlefield intelligence files. He had his personal mission logs from all 19 planets. He had testimony statements from 206 human-resistant survivors from the Veth corridor, all of them signed and verified and cross-referenced with the Coalition's own records. He laid them on the table in front of the security panel and said nothing for a moment. Then he said that he had read every document that had been released about Valith, and that he could trace the origin of each one. He said the cipher used in the fabricated documents was not the same cipher Valith had used in her real messages. It was close, but it had 3 systematic errors in the way it handled verb tenses in Old Crath. He said anyone who had actually read her real messages would have spotted this immediately. He said that the fabrication had been done by someone who understood the cipher's structure, but had never written in it. He said the source was a communication relay connected to a neutral zone monitoring station. The security panel was very quiet. 3 Krath noble houses that had already been considering breaking from the old emperor's loyalist network issued formal statements of separation within the week. It was not because they had suddenly developed principles. It was because they had watched a 7th daughter sit alone in a formal chamber for 4 hours and not break, and they had made a calculation about which side of history they wanted to be recorded on. The fabricated documents were officially classified as a hostile disinformation operation. The investigation was closed. The Institute's partnerships were reinstated with formal apologies. The old Fail woman who had been studying Craft territorial law came back first. She brought 3 new students with her. Valith sat in her office that evening and looked at the stacks of books and said nothing for a long time. She had not needed rescuing. She had held the room for 4 hours because she had always known what she had done and why. She had not needed someone to come in and save her. What Ethan had done was different. He had spent a week finding the evidence she already deserved. He had not defended her. He had armed her. There was a difference, and it mattered enormously. 5 years after the war ended, the galaxy was the most stable it had been in recorded history. This was not an accident, and everyone knew it. It was the product of an enormous amount of careful, unglamorous work done by thousands of beings across hundreds of worlds. It was the product of reconstruction teams, and agricultural agreements, and water rights settlements, and language education programs, and trade route negotiations, and 10,000 small decisions made by people who understood that peace was not a thing that simply arrived and stayed. It had to be built every day out of whatever materials were available. The Valith Accords were the foundation of most of it. She had written them over 8 months in the 3rd year after the war. She had worked alone, mostly at a desk in the Institute, with 3 assistants who handled research requests, and one very old translation program that she had modified herself because it made errors with old Craft verb forms. The Accords were not a single document. They were a framework, a living system of principles and processes that could adapt to new situations without requiring the parties involved to start over from nothing. The framework addressed territorial disputes, cultural rights, resource sharing, succession law, refugee status, and a dozen other categories that previous peace agreements had either ignored or handled so badly that they created new problems. The framework had been reviewed by 400 legal scholars from 19 species before it was presented to the Coalition, and not one of them could find a structural flaw. They found things they wanted to argue about, but not flaws. The coalition adopted it unanimously in the fourth year. That had never happened before. Unanimous votes at the coalition level required agreement from species that had been disagreeing about fundamental things since before recorded history. That it happened at all was considered by many observers to be the single most surprising political event of the post-war period. The Infinite Star was the coalition's highest honor. It had been given out 17 times in 400 years. It was given for contributions so significant that the normal categories of award simply could not contain them. The ceremony was held on Aurelius Prime in the same great hall where the Grand Conclave had convened 5 years before. Every species sent representatives. The seats were filled. The gallery was full. The ceremony was broadcast across the coalition's entire communication network to every world in the alliance. The Drawn Council sent their full leadership. The Fail sent their eldest academicians. The Valorian Home Fleet sent an honor guard that lined both sides of the main entrance. The Moth sent a delegation of 7 elders who had never left their home system before, and who stood very close together and looked at everything with wide, careful eyes. The young Krath diplomat Reth, who had defected before the war's end, was now the head of the new Krath Transitional Council. He sat in the front row, in the full formal dress of his new position. He had helped negotiate 7 of the territorial agreements that the Accords framework had produced. He had learned to do that in large part from attending seminars at the Institute. Sora Vel, the conclave chair, he had written Ethan's choice into the official record 5 years ago, stood at the podium and spoke about the work of the past 5 years. She was not given to dramatic speeches, but even she paused twice while speaking, and both times it was because she was looking at the document in her hands, and then at the hall full of beings who were alive and present and not at war, and she needed a moment to hold both things at once. Then Valeth walked to the podium. She was not the same being who had stood at a detention cell window 5 years ago, looking at the stars and not quite believing she was allowed to move freely. She was still quiet. She still preferred listening to talking. She still kept her sentences simple, because she had learned that simple sentences were harder to misunderstand. She still arrived early to every room, because arriving early meant she could choose where to sit, and she always chose the spot with the best line of sight to the door. But she stood at that podium in front of the galaxy, and she was not small. She spoke for 12 minutes. She thanked her research assistants by name. She thanked the 400 legal scholars who had reviewed the Accords. She thanked the Moth elders for sharing their water records. She thanked Issy for being the first official to listen to her in a meeting. She thanked Reth for asking her a question in a corridor that had made her think about what trust actually meant. Then she said that she wanted to trace everything back to its beginning. She said that she had spent most of her life invisible. She said that she had been invisible not because she was absent, but because the world around her had decided what she was worth before it ever listened to what she had done. She said that kind of invisibility was not rare. It happened to beings of every species, every day. Tragedy of it was not just what the invisible person lost, but what everyone else lost, because they had decided not to look. She said that the most important moment of her life had been standing in a detention corridor when a human soldier had stopped in front of her cell and asked her name. She said that he was not the first being to know her name, but he was the first one who asked it like the answer mattered. He had then read her file, and not just the part that said what she was worth. He had read the whole thing and found in it what she had actually done. She said that was a radical act. She said it was the most radical act one being could perform for another. She said it was the foundation of everything that followed. She said the galaxy was capable of this. She said it was capable of looking. She said the Accords were built on the assumption that if you gave beings the right tools and the right information, they would generally make reasonable choices, and that assumption had proven correct more often than not. She said that was a hopeful thing, and she intended to keep building on it. She stepped back from the podium, and the hall stood up. The applause from 7 species in that hall was a complicated sound. It was loud, and it had different rhythms because different species clapped differently. The Drawn struck their palms together in a single hard beat. The Fail made a high ringing sound with their fingers. The Valorian honor guards struck their ceremonial staffs on the floor. The Moth elders stood very straight and were very still, which was how their people showed profound respect. Soravel placed the medal around Valeth's neck and said something to her quietly that nobody else in the hall could hear. Valeth nodded once. She stepped down from the stage and walked across the hall. There were dignitaries in the first rows, ambassadors, general officers, noble representatives of 12 governments, people who had traveled from far away specifically to be close to this moment. When it arrived, she walked past all of them. She walked to the back row. Ethan was sitting in the last seat on the left side. He was wearing a plain gray civilian jacket. His hair was slightly too long, and he had not shaved that morning. He was clapping along with everyone else with the unhurried expression of someone who had been waiting for this moment, without impatience, because he had known it was coming. Valeth sat down next to him. The hall was still applauding. All those species from all those worlds making all their different sounds of recognition for what she had built. She looked at him. He looked at her. She said thank you, very quietly. He said he had just read the file. She said she knew. They sat together in the last row and watched the galaxy they had helped hold together spin on around them, and the hall was full of light and sound, and neither of them said anything else, because nothing else needed to be said. Sometimes the most important thing in the universe is simply a person who looks at you and asks what you have done, instead of what you are worth. Everything else follows from there.